Bienvenidos a un capítulo más de Diálogos Sensoriales. En esta ocasión tengo el privilegio de platicar con Goldman. Ella es graduada en Ciencias de la Alimentación por la Universidad de Londres y Leeds. Ella comenzó su carrera profesional en la industria alimentaria en Reino Unido, trabajando en investigación en DSIR, Fonterra, y bueno, ha participado como profesora en la Universidad de Massey en Nueva Zelanda. Además de la Universidad de Guelph en Canadá. Ella es orgullosa miembro de la empresa ACCE International, una empresa canadiense de investigación sensorial del consumidor, la cual ayudó a fundar hace más de 30 años. Ella es miembro del IFT, certificada en alimentos, galardonada con el premio al logro en ciencias sensoriales y del consumidor en 2016 por el IFT, dada su contribución de por vida de apoyo activo y avances en el campo de investigación sensorial y del consumidor, recibiendo también el premio honorario David Peryam por la ciencia sensorial aplicada. Y bueno, Anne fue co-chair recientemente del simposio sensorial Pangorn en el año pasado. Demos la bienvenida a Anne. Anne, welcome to this sensory dialogues or diálogos sensoriales. Thank you for accepting this to participate into this series of events.
And thank you for inviting me.
Okay, I have 50 years of experience, I guess, mainly working in consumer and sensory research, and but I have many questions. I mean, you have the honor of being an IFT Fellow, and you have the prize of David R. Peryam Award, and many questions came to my head, but we have a few times. So let's start with our first question. Where did you learn sensory evaluation?
Well, I certainly didn't learn an awful lot during my degree process because at the time, food science programs, certainly in the UK, didn't actually teach very much sensory. And so I had a brief introduction to it when I was at Leeds because there was a program there where they were developing the new style hospital catering system, which was freeze thaw type meals, which back in the 60s was an innovation. And so they had determined they needed to use sensory in order to evaluate the different components of the meals, etc., and to get acceptance. So I think we were briefly shown the merits of some basic sensory testing tests in that when we were doing those studies in that program. So it really was on the job as how I learned it. And it was really through being very much involved in product development. That was where I started my career. I was working in product development for a company in the UK. And then when I moved to New Zealand in 1970, in 72, I joined the Dairy Research Institute in Palmerston North, which is now known as Fonterra. And they already had a very substantial sensory program with various trained panels to assess different types of dairy products, dairy ingredients, milk powders, casein powders, etc. And they had had training from the Arthur D. Little Institute, which was very much a strong supplier back in those days in the US. And they were, you know, ahead of their time in terms of an institute that had embraced sensory. So that's where I got, I'd say, my grounding under a lady called the late Mary Humphreys. And then I also worked at Massey University with Mary Earle, who was, again, very much into product development, but had seen the merits and the usefulness of sensory in guiding the product development process. So that was my essential grounding to really get to embrace it and to realize what a great career this could be. Although I didn't realize at the time that that would be my my modus operandus for the next 40 years. So, but absolutely, it's so essential.
Right. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, it's just so essential to developing an acceptable product for the marketplace. How else do you get there? Because it's just a fundamental.
Right. Do you have in mind that precise moment when you realized you were working entirely into sensory field? I mean, okay, now my time is more on sensory than other topics.
Oh, at what point was that? Well, again, as in any sort of early career, we'd actually then moved back to the UK. So I was always having to follow. I basically followed my husband around the world as his jobs changed. And so it was always a case of having to find a job that would satisfy my career aspirations. And when we went back to the UK, there wasn't a lot of sensory. Again, it was more in product development. I was working in a meat processing company. And they hadn't really embraced sensory in the sense that we talk about it today. They did team tastings. So I certainly knew all about team tastings when, people talk about that now, because there's a new ASTM standard for that now. But it was a case of, finding the work that would also meet what I enjoyed doing. And then when we moved to Canada, I worked at the University of Guelph, and I was an assistant professor there for a time, and ended up actually working with one of the sensory professors there and teaching one of the sensory courses. So that was how I got as you say, more academic experience, more academic exposure, I would say. I had academic exposure in New Zealand at Massey and then later at Guelph. So that to me gave me the package of things that I needed to be a consultant, which is what ultimately I've been since 1986 at ACCE and building that company in the sensory world. I always think if you're going to be a consultant, you need to have a few different pieces to your bag of tricks, and certainly that was that all that experience that I'd had in the industry world, in the academic world, in the research world, it all helped because that's how and I'd actually also worked in New Zealand in a government agency that supported the regulatory needs of the food industry. So I had I had sort of experience all around, which is, I think, again, not only helpful for being a consultant in this field, because you do need to know where all the pieces in the jigsaw are in a company. You need to know where what regulatory does, what quality assurance does, what R&D does, and then, of course, what marketing does. That's another big piece to understand. And so all of this came together to be what I ended up being. And I, was always grateful for all these different experiences. And I always say to people when they're, starting out in their career, don't be afraid to try something new. Don't necessarily poo-poo that job because, it's not in the pigeonhole that I really want to be in. I think it's really important to get a range of experience so that you're better equipped to do a more senior role because you understand all the different pieces.
Yeah, well, I remember you. I met you during one IFT held in New Orleans, and you were sitting in this table, giving the welcome to the new people. Why doing that? Why and Goldman was doing that?
That must have been one of these. Yeah, it would have been with the SED, right?
Right.
Yes. Well, again, I've always been conscious of welcoming new people into our field too, and I think again, and again, it goes back to when I first appeared on the North American scene, when I moved to Canada, and then I started being engaged with IFT, the SED group, or SCSD as it is now, and also ASTM, the E18 committee. I was always very grateful for the people that engaged with me, the more senior people, the David Peryams of this world, who, you know, were happy to talk to somebody who was newer in the field. And I think that's really important to always be, you know, welcoming to new faces, because that's how we grow our field. And we have grown our field. We've done a great job at just expanding our field. You just look at the latest Pangorn that we just held last year in August. We had a much bigger reach around the globe. We had record attendance, and it's just so important to spread our field, because it is still a pretty small group. And there's still lots of people that don't know about it or understand it. So it's really important.
Right. And do you remember your first symposium or meeting, global meeting, I mean?
I certainly remember the first Pangorn meeting that was in Helsinki. I mean, there's other ones. I mean, other meetings prior to that I wasn't necessarily presenting at, but the first Pangorn meeting I always thought was pretty memorable, because that was the very first one that Heli Turelia and her colleagues in both Europe and North America pulled together, because they felt it was so important to recognize Rosemary's memory. And that was that was the most intimate meeting, probably. It was small. It wasn't in a big, you know, huge big auditorium. It was more rustic, shall we say? And it was lovely. It was lovely. It was outside of, about an hour's drive outside Helsinki, in the country, next to Sibelius's home, and if you know that composer, and yeah, it was really lovely. It was out in the wilds, because there wasn't much around apart from the beautiful country, and it was an opportunity. Yes, just I think there were about 350 people there, so it was a much, or if there were even that, it was fun. It was a good meeting.
Right. So that will be your favorite meeting, or
yeah, I think it probably. I do. I always have happy memories of that meeting. It was, yes, it was. Yeah, and the fact that you sort of sat round in the evenings or in the intervals, just chatting with the Harry Lawlesses and people of that, and I think Howard Schutz was there. Yeah, I mean, some of the, you know, the greats in our field that, you know, have published so much and contributed so much to our field in the past.
Yeah, people who already you normally knew by name. I mean, because you read the paper, the book.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly, people coming to the field now, they're just they're just names on a textbook. They don't know these people. But that's why I feel I'm fortunate. I knew a lot of these people, and and it was it was very helpful to to me as I developed my career.
Great. And how difficult for you was applying sensory in the field? I mean, at the beginning.
Well, yeah, I think certainly when we started our consulting business, we started ACCE in '86. At that time, sensory was very much part of just the R&D function. And I'd already knew from the work I'd done at Massey, and again, my exposure, as I was just alluding to, that sensory was more than just this little pocket in R&D. And so we, Ray and myself, did lots of presentations to market research individuals, and we're just introducing them to sensory. And of course, it was a new thing. They thought they knew how to do some bit of sensory in a survey with some jar scales, but they didn't really understand the meaning of sensory panels and the relationship of panel work to the consumer piece, etc., etc. So that was quite an uphill struggle to convince people to convince marketing and market research people how important sensory was. But once we, say, got into the companies and did a project with them and showed them the value of how sensory can then help them make a better decision, and then the marketing people were just sold. They were, once they saw the value of it, which was basically not them preventing them from making a hideous mistake, like launching something that just crashed and bombed. They were more than ready to accept it, but that all took some time. That wasn't an overnight success. And, we weren't alone. There were other sensory suppliers also trying to do that. But some would always stay more in the R&D side of the business. And I just think that's a mistake. I think you have to try and collaborate. I mean, that was always right from the early days, we saw that we talked about this bridge between marketing and R&D departments and how we wanted to combine, not so much combine them, but have a dialogue across that bridge that then, became more understandable, and how this could then just help the whole process. And that certainly has improved over the years, and certainly now.
Right. Speaking about that bridge, do you think it's more difficult to make the foundations on the technical side or on the marketing side, or it's the same trouble?
To make the decisions, or to make the
to make that communication?
It depends sometimes on the company. It depends on the culture of the company, I would say. Some have done it better than others. I just always remember the very first job I had when in the UK, which the company was called Bovril, but the brands now are owned by Unilever, and who knows who else now. And they had just built this R&D facility, which was in a totally different part of the country to marketing and production. The three were miles apart. I mean, like a day's drive, or maybe not a day, but a long way, quite a long way from each other. And that's back in the 60s, when you didn't have email or all this modern communication that we have. So it was very difficult to communicate because they weren't in the same building, let alone on the same campus. So I think that's part of the problem sometimes, if there's just physical separation. Nowadays, that's easy because you could do a Zoom call with somebody, which is, of course, everybody's doing now anyway. In this past 2 years, we'll have to, that's the only way to communicate almost.
Right.
But sometimes it's just physical location, because you're not in the same building or close to each other. It's just not easy sometimes to form that relationship and get yourself into that facility to see what's going on. So that's sometimes the barrier. And then there's personal communication styles, etc. So it's something people certainly need to be aware of and work on, because it's an important part of getting our sensory message to be utilized correctly.
Right, communicate the data. That's difficult, yes, because normally we do sensory. Okay, there are differences. Okay, or no, or whatever methodology. But how do you transmit that? It's quite difficult.
Yes,
there are many ways of thinking. Do you have I don't know, maybe a good memory about how easy was that presentation, or how difficult was that presentation for a client, for instance?
Yeah, I think the good memories are certainly when, as I say, we showed a result that maybe made a marketing person realize, oh my goodness, I could have made an awful, I could have really stumbled here if I hadn't made, used this information for the right decision. And then there's good memories where we were with our early projects, we showed them just the value, and then the product was a great success. Mm-hmm. And then they were just sold after that. They just couldn't have it. You couldn't have enough of these sensory projects.
Right.
I mean, once they see the value and the company then understands it, and it becomes part of the culture, that's very satisfying to see that. And we certainly have seen that over the years, where it was just so hard initially to get into the company, to convince, maybe they had an outside, there was one company I do recall, they had an outside consultant who was very much more rigid market research mindset, mm-hmm, and very hard to sort of try and show how, our work could be really helpful. And then eventually, we worked and things, the culture somewhat changed anyway, and they just embraced it. And then it just makes, it's then not such hard work you don't have to be always doing that convincing part. You already have them convinced, and then you can have that dialogue. Well, we can do this, or we can do that with this project. We can do this methodology, or we can bring some panel work in to help to do some drivers, drivers of lighting. You can have a proper dialogue around how you're going to do the research. Mm-hmm. And that's so much more satisfying than always having to be convincing them that, yes, this will help and this will work. So yes, that's really the good, what the good memories are about.
And what about a company that hire you and they have this, let's say, failure report? I mean, they fail on the develop, or they didn't accomplish the I don't know, the marketing strategy or the product were not satisfied were not accepted by the consumer. How about that? I mean, did you receive some, I don't know, angry people or something like that?
Yes, there's always situations where they for whatever reason, maybe they didn't take or maybe the product changed after they did the research. Something else happened to it, or the actual marketing campaign was a disaster. The product might have been very acceptable, but the marketing or whatever else they were doing around it was not a success. And that, I think, sometimes then speaks to the fact, well, in the research, you need to, and this is why we're doing more and more of this now, you need not just to do the blind sensory assessment, but you also need to do the sensory assessment with the branding or with the however they're going to do the marketing positioning. So to do some more in context research to show that if you do this and this, and you also have this great tasting product, then you will have a success. So again, you learn from these situations where maybe this was what happened, and therefore, can we prevent that next time? So even if there are missteps along the way, try and learn from it. Right. Again, sometimes not easy, because then the marketing person's disappeared from the they've moved on to another product, which we know that happens a lot, but too, and just think other things change in the business, or the business gets sold to somebody else. We over our period of, since '86, we've seen so many changes of ownership of the business, of the businesses we work with. And so the culture changes, the individuals change. And so we've tended to be, the keeper of the history of that product as it's transposed through so many people. Right. And being handled by so many people. And yet here we still are doing it, looking after it, the custodian of this product, which we've worked on for 30 years. So
as an international company, which is the hardest task you have performed? I mean, speaking about the methodology or the product or maybe the country.
Yeah, I think the trickiest one I ever had, and this is one I often allude to, is we had an environmental project which was affecting some specialized sort of fish called an oolican. It's a little sort of little very fatty fish that spawns every year in the rivers in northern British Columbia. And the indigenous population were complaining that it didn't taste like it used to. They were blaming some effluent from some process that was going on at the time. And so we were brought in by environmental consultants to try and figure out, some methodologies for assessing the fish.
Okay. Wow.
So we went off up to the outback of British Columbia and conducted some studies with some of the indigenous population as panelists. So that was pretty tricky. Right. And so that was, yes, that was quite a challenging project, but quite a lot of fun too.
I know, yes. Wow.
Very scenic part of the world, I might say.
And what about the presentation of the results? Was that, I don't know, don't get into details, just in a general way.
Yeah, that was all very tortuous too, because we were dealing with an environmental aid company, a consulting company who were all engineers. Wow. And they didn't understand sensory at all. So you can sort of just imagine how much fun that presentation was.
Wow.
It was also, and then it also became a bit of a political hot potato as a project too. So that was sort of, in a way, my feeling. Maybe not get involved with that kind of work too much because it's...
Wow, interesting. Okay, and well, let's move a little bit in another part of the interview, which is like practicing a little bit of sensory. I will ask some comparisons, and you need to decide which of them you prefer. They are forced decision, so no ties allowed. So, red wine or white wine?
I think white wine actually is my preferred these days.
Okay, okay. So it depends.
Although it's pretty hard because New Zealand Pinot Noir is, yeah, possibly would win out, yes.
Okay. Tetrad testing or triangle test?
Tetrad.
City or forest?
Forest.
Traditional descriptive analysis or rapid methods?
Traditional, I think, is still pretty strong. Yeah.
Breakfast or dinner?
Dinner.
Analytical or consumer testing?
Consumer.
Meat or fish?
Fish.
Okay. Thank you for your answers. How do you think is sensory evaluation evolved in these recent years? I mean, I know these 2 years has been different, but speaking about, let's say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, or even more years ago, which is how far I go back. Well, certainly automation has been the big change from early days sensory, for sure. In the last 10 years, I would say a lot more acceptance of the consumer in context, focus on the relationship with the descriptive sensory, you know, the more traditional descriptive sensory with assisting consumer research. And of course, again, more recently, the additional tools that we have in terms of, social media involvement, the engagement, which of course has all helped for this latest period of the last 2 years. Well, if you weren't automated and engaged somehow with a way of engaging with consumers remotely, then I'm sure it must have been very difficult for companies that hadn't done that. And then the other big, I think the other evolvement has been into the non-food categories too. Traditionally sensory was always grounded around food. In fact, that's how we've almost been alluding to already in this talk, but there's been huge strides in the non-food categories in the last 10 or so years or more. And much more engagement and requirement for sensory in those fields, like the Lululemon that we had speaking at Pangorn, who knew, how important it is to have a large sensory guidance department within a clothing company. It's essential to their business, obviously, because that's touch and feel is very much and skin how they develop their products. And now you're just looking at the number of job opportunities too. Back 20 years ago or so, there weren't the same number of opportunities. So it's all very encouraging.
Right. What is the most surprising thing you have seen in the sensory field, either the technical or the consumer part, from your point of view, of course?
I think the fact that it's now embraced more across more businesses and different types of businesses, and just that it is much more integrated into the corporate world now, and it's more recognized as an important function. I think that's really the most encouraging sign.
Okay, and what do you think about neuromarketing?
Neuromarketing.
You're right.
Well, what do you think about it?
Well, using these gadgets to measure the reaction.
I think, well, there's obviously still lots of research to be done. Until we have gadgets that can be more easily used without encumbering the way it's performed. You know, it's all very well, you know, doing MMR measurements, etc., but it's not the most comfortable situation for a consumer to be evaluating products. So yes, there's certainly lots to learn there, and I think, again, I think as technology improves, the measurement of the responses becomes less invasive, maybe for the consumer, we will get more and more information, and be more helpful to the day-to-day kind of projects, is what I'm thinking of. Absolutely, it's an area for academic research to get more understanding. But in terms of regular projects that go on day to day, we need a less invasive way of doing it.
Yeah, actually, wearing those helmets or glasses, it's kind of distracting at the beginning.
Yeah, that's right, because the human person can only concentrate on one thing. Well, most people can only concentrate on one thing at a time. So if they've got something that's disorienting them or interfering with somehow, it's hard for them to then say how much they like this ice cream, or the feel of this new swimsuit, or whatever it is that they're evaluating.
Yeah, that in addition to the use of the scales, because some people use 9-point, 7-point, or 3-point scales. Do you have a favorite scale, or maybe the one you recommend?
We've always typically adhered to the 9-point for hedonic measurements, and I've also been in favor of ideal scaling too, which is a lot longer scale too, but that's just a personal preference.
I know, yes, I know there are many people, or some people, who works with different scale than the 9-point scale.
But we've also always been in favor of generating databases too, so try and stick to one scale so that you then have some normative databases you can build.
Yeah,
that's we've always encouraged that.
Yes, interesting. What would be, if any, the minimum methodologies or consumer tools that a sensory scientist need to study? Do you have one?
In terms of a textbook, or
in terms of field work, or okay, you are going to enter into the industry, so
so what you should sort of have an experience of,
right, or study, or at least know the basic for those.
Well, ideally, you do sort of need to know, you know, the difference between discrimination and acceptance methodologies. So what's a discrimination method? You know, you alluded to tetrad triangle. So have an understanding of those, to have an understanding of what trained descriptive can do for you, and then to have an understanding of what kind of consumer acceptance measures you can use to get acceptance of a product.
Right.
And what's appropriate to ask in those cases.
Understood. And when you do recruitment for a sensory leader or somebody who is going to work with you, which are the skills you are looking for? The basic skills.
Yeah, well, we typically want to have because there are degree programs, obviously, with sensory specialization now, we look for that if we can. However, if that isn't, if it isn't possible, we are absolutely open to training on the job too, because we don't think that that's a problem either. We're happy to do that. But we need to sort of have some certainly basic scientific skills, you know, research, report writing, basic techniques around some analysis techniques. And if they've done, say, a consumer behavior course or some market research applied courses, that's also very helpful.
Right, interesting. And can you describe sensory in like just one word? I think it's impossible, but a few words or a small phrase.
The field, the sensory.
The sensory field.
Well, it's applied. It's across many disciplines, which I think is why you know, it's always so difficult sometimes for people to understand it. It's very much a multidisciplinary science, and you, as I alluded to earlier, it's very helpful if you have a bit of a multidisciplinary background in order to be able to apply it, because that's how it's just so helpful to understand the complex. It's complex, you know. It is a complex field, because trying to manage a product to its success is a very complex process. And okay, you have an important part in that, but you need to know how you connect it to the other parts.
Okay, and how sensory evaluation changed and life? I mean, what if, have you ever considered if you didn't work as a sensory scientist or sensory and consumer, what other profession or activity will you be doing at this moment?
What I would have been doing, that's a difficult one. I mean, I always loved biological sciences, so anything with respect to plants, growing plants. I could see I could have been a horticulturalist or been in that field, because that's another of my. I mean, food was my entry into sensory, no doubt, because I did food science. And that was all because of my mother was a home economist, and I'd learned all about putting A, B, and C together to make something edible. So right from the early days. So Product development, food science was my training, but I love biological sciences too. I loved zoology and botany too. So I could have gone into that field too.
Right.
If I hadn't had my mother's influence.
Okay. If you could tell something to Anne 50 years ago, remember that she at that time she was not able to imagine that she will work into sensory. What would you say to her?
Yeah, well, follow your passions. I think that's what you do need to do. When you sort of trying to figure out, what should you study, where should you go? Follow your passions, but at the same time, have the sense to think, will this actually enable me to support myself and earn a living? So, which is a hard thing for anybody, in their early teenage years or whatever, to think about, as we know. But if there's a subject that really, you enjoy doing, you love it, you love studying it, well, then that's probably a good route to go.
Right.
But investigate what you could do as a job.
That's important.
Which is hard to do. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, sometimes at the age of 17 or like that, you need to decide what you are going to do the rest of your life.
Yeah,
so
yeah, it is. But you can still change pathways as one does, and then, as I say, don't turn up opportunities that come along the way, even though they may not be your dream job. Think of it from the point of view, well, I might, what will I learn from this? I could learn something that'll help to put in my, bag of tricks.
Yes. And do you have a sensory book, poster, paper that can be suggested for the people who is starting at sensory at this point? Yeah,
there's a good, I think it's called a handbook of sensory, but it's by Sarah Kemp, Tracy Hollowood and Joanne Hort. I think it was published over 10 years ago, but it's a good it's a smallish book. And it's a good basic one. It just covers a lot of the basic things. When you're saying, what should people study? That's a really, I think is a very readable and not a big. It's not a heavy tome. So that's one I would recommend for somebody starting out. I think it's available free online. I think.
Okay.
Pretty sure it is. I think it's downloadable. Just Google Sarah Kemp.
Okay.
And it'll pop up. I think it's called Handbook. Yeah, no, it's a good one. And then I'd also recommend anybody who's certainly already in the field, the ASTM E18 committee. It's very affordable. Membership per year, and you get access to all of the sensory standards, and you also see what the latest standard is that's been introduced for all the methodologies. There's one in particular that's very helpful if anybody's doing anything around advertising claims, that type of research. So I'd always encourage people to get a membership of that.
Right. And you are part of the ASTM, right?
I'm a past chair and have always been involved with it, yes.
Okay, so let's browse for those books and standards. Time flies, and well, we need to finish this talk. I mean, thank you very much for your time and your desire to share your story and experiences. I'm sure that many people will be inspired by your experience as well. Anything else you want to add? Would you like to add to this conversation?
No, this was a real pleasure. I always enjoy sharing my experience, and if there is anybody who is new in the field or thinking of getting into the field, I'm always happy to talk to them too, to, you know, encourage them and talk about, you know, how they can. Oh,
that's my dog. Sorry, she likes always to bark at this, during this interview. Sorry, and
saying hello.
Yeah, she's saying hello. Do you have like a page or contact email if you like to share to the people who?
Yes, it's agoldman@accceintl.com, and I'm on LinkedIn too, so you can find me there.
Perfect. Finally, Anne, do you have something that you really like doing sensory?
What I really like? Oh, eating chocolate.
Perfect.
Never give that up. Never give that up.
Never. Wine and chocolate, right?
Wine and chocolate. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Perfect. The perfect match.
No, this has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, and see you hopefully in the next meeting in person.
Yeah, really hopefully. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Thank you so much. A ustedes, muchas gracias por vernos. Nos esperamos en el siguiente capítulo de Diálogos Sensoriales. Recuerden, si les gustó, tener like. Si no, no digan nada. Nos vemos hasta la siguiente. Ciao, Juan. Thank you so much.
Ciao, thank you.
Ciao, ciao.